Yes, with raising a child, you have to begin in the very first days, because it is just a fact that babies have to learn the habits and manners of the adult world, so that later as adults, they will be able to move well in life. And even though right now the world is not so pretty, one day the sun will break through the clouds, and from a pretty flower, a kind deed by another person, from our beloved little children so innocent and unconscious of the cruel events, we can get joy every day. Learn to appreciate the little things and pick happiness every day that you are alive, not from the future, because then you are always chasing your happiness and you forget to look at what today gives you. Remember that for the rest of your life.
Germany was in a bad economic way. The government was in somewhat of turmoil, and people were looking for something new. And Hitler's ideas that were part of the Nazi Party were what they thought they wanted. He considered the Jews a race of racially inferior people, and that they are cause of all the problems in Germany, mainly because they were in areas economically that people wanted to be in. A lot of Jews were bankers, they had professional status, they were merchants, so if somebody wanted to blame somebody for why something was too expensive or there wasn't enough of something, they could blame the Jews because they were the ones who were responsible for the selling and buying of goods, things like that. And there was the idea of racial purity, which was called Aryan, and that was something that also was a proponent of the Nazi Party. They thought that people should be racially pure, and Jews were viewed as not being racially pure. The idea that Jews are a race is erroneous because it's a religion, it's not a race. But it was one and the same as far as Hitler and the Nazis were concerned. He came in on at a time. He wasn't necessarily popular at first. He didn't win all the elections, but there were several things that happened in Germany that made the Nazis look good. And in 1933, Hitler came to power, and then not too long after that, the Chancellor resigned, and he basically declared himself the Führer, the leader of the country at the time. So in a sense, people were looking for something different, a change from the issues that World War I caused in Germany, to make the economy questionable and to make something new go on in Germany, to make it a better place, a productive society of racially pure people. His idea was to eradicate the Jews in all of Europe. So he eventually entered every country, invaded countries one by one, and then put his actions into work, and they were able to expel a lot of the Jews from one country to another, send them to extermination or first to concentration camps, and then later on extermination camps when the Nazis got their killing machine, if you want to call it that, up and running and efficient. The Germans are nothing if not efficient at whatever they did. Well, and he pushed the idea of racial purity and that the Jews were racially inferior, and that then got people to believe that they were the cause of all the problems in Europe. So many people did not believe. They said, this can't happen, it can't get worse, this is ridiculous. They were going to take all of Europe, and they planned to come to the United States as well. That was another thing. It was a crazy vision that they had, that they were going to be able to do this so easily and efficiently, and that no one was going to fight back. Because it seemed as though initially that not too many people did fight back. So in the studies of what the Nazis left after World War II, they tried to destroy most of the paperwork, but things that they did find, the efficiency was amazing. IBM did business with the Germans during the whole of World War II, and contributed to the efficiency of the Nazi machine. That's what a phrase was used often. Every country had some kind of, they had, you saw birth certificates, addresses, people, you had to census information, things like that. And they wanted the information about your religion was part of that. Who knows? Any place they could find information, they would get it. And I think that's contributed to the fear that nobody was safe. And luckily for some of the smart people, they got out of Germany. Sometimes they didn't go too far enough. Anne Frank's family left Germany, but Holland was not far enough away for them.
My birthday is November 14th, 1939. I was born in Alkmaar, which is in the northern part of the Netherlands.
My name is Maarten de Kadt. I was born in the Netherlands, in Alkmaar, in 1941. My mother and father and grandparents didn't leave Holland. I think they thought the Germans didn't invade Holland in the First World War. Why should they invade Holland now? I think they thought they were safe.
They may have had the opportunity to leave before Hitler invaded Holland, but they stayed to protect the business that the family had. I think maybe also everybody was in a little bit of denial about what would happen to them. After Hitler invaded Holland in 1940, they couldn't leave.
Some of the images that I have are of my father in uniform, hobnobbing with the Dutch military police. He probably thought he was safe. They weren't.
They realized that in about 1942, 2 years after the invasion, when they felt no longer safe in Alkmaar, and they moved south, a little bit south, to Amsterdam, maybe an hour or so south of Alkmaar, and moved in with my mother's parents, because that was the time that there was an edict that the Nazis had when all the Jews had to come to Amsterdam.
That would have been in early 1942 that they moved to Amsterdam. They were arrested and deported in August of 1942.
There was literally a knock on the door where the Nazis came.
The police came and took them. They invaded the house. They
took my parents. The reason they didn't take my mother's parents at that time is because they were only interested in younger Jews who were able to work for the war effort and do other kinds of work. So they let the older people go for the time, and they took my parents and me. My brother, who was an infant at the time, he was 8 months old, he happened to be sleeping in the bathtub.
Police either noticed and didn't care that there was an infant in the bathtub, or they didn't notice that there was an infant in the bathtub. But in any case, I wasn't taken with them.
And they put him there on purpose, thinking that would be a safe place, and it was, because he was overlooked. So they took my mother, my father, and me to this rounding up place, the Hollandse Schouwburg, and my grandparents even came along to say goodbye. And in the confusion, because there were a lot of other people there, they were able to hand me back to my grandparents so that I was not deported at all. But they were rounded up. They took a train.
The way I heard this story is they were encouraged to write postcards. A lot of the people that were on the transport, the train, did throw postcards from the train, and they were retrieved and mailed to the addresses on them. And that was the last we heard from my parents. We are doing well, the postcard says, here at W, meaning Westerbork. Take care of our darlings, I think it says, but preferably not at your house.
Westerbork at that time, and that was that's a transit camp in Holland, not in Germany or Poland, where they stayed for a very short time, though. Because the idea, if you went to Westerbork, was for Jews who went there, was to make yourself useful. Westerbork was a little town. They had a real hierarchy of organization there. They had secretaries who did intake work and recorded who was coming in. They had, so if you could type, that was useful. They had soccer teams. They had an orchestra. They had a library, and they needed people to work in all those places and to keep those kind of organizations going. But apparently, my parents didn't fit into any of those niches, so they didn't stay at Westerbork very long. And the basic route from Westerbork was to go to Auschwitz, and that's where they ended up. They also didn't stay there very long, and they were murdered in Auschwitz.
Murdered the day they came, August 10th, 1941. My father was 26, my mother was 22.
By then, in 1942, my grandparents, who were people of some means, saw that they had to, both for my brother and me, had to hide our identities, or else we would not be safe either. So they found families for us, 2 different Gentile families who were willing to take us. My brother had a Protestant family, and I had a Catholic family who they were the in-laws of my grandmother's seamstress, who came to the house a couple of times a week to do the mending and ironing and so on. So I was placed with them, and my brother had his own family to go to.
There was an intermediary, somebody my grandmother knew, who knew somebody, and arranged to take me from my grandmother's house and bring me to the house of the people that took care of me for the first 4 years of my life, 1942 to early 1946.
I was treated very well. They had 2 daughters who were maybe 5 and 7 years older than I was, and they took me in as their own. To my recollection, for the 4 years that I was with them, I was treated just like one of their own. My name did not change. Wilhelmina is my name, and I took on their last name, not legally, though. And I felt fairly safe there, and the neighbors all kept the secret, and I know that my hiding sisters told me that there was some neighbor down the street around the corner that they weren't too certain about how, that they would keep the secret, but nobody betrayed me, which is unlike the story of Anne Frank, who was betrayed by the Dutch police for a bounty, basically. But no, I was safe, physically safe. Now, I had thoughts of not being so safe whenever I saw a person in a uniform, and I was too young to discern the difference between the mailman and the milkman. Had milkmen in those days. I would go and run and hide under the dining room table out of fear. My grandparents stayed in the house. They had a house in Amsterdam, which was a big house in a good part of town. But that too, they moved out. They were forced to move out of that house, and we're not sure whether they were forced because all the Jewish people had to live like in the Jewish ghetto in Amsterdam. And in addition to that, I think the business wasn't thriving, and perhaps my grandfather could no longer afford that house. So they stayed in that house until about 1944, when they too were deported. They went to Bergen-Belsen, which is a concentration camp. My grandfather died there, and shortly before the war was over, he died of illness and what happens to you, starvation, all sorts of bad things in the concentration camp. My grandmother, who was always a very strong woman, survived with the liberation.
The war ended for them in 1945. My grandmother was very sick, had to recover in a hospital.
And when she was well enough, she collected us, my brother and me, from our parents. I was 6. So I was with the foster parents for about 4 years. Well, that must have been a very difficult transition. But again, I was so young that, and I think they did everything in their power to protect both my brother and myself from that kind of trauma.
In stages. I visit with my grandmother in her then dwelling for longer and longer periods of time until I didn't go back to the Ulysses. And then I have a memory of coming to the United States in an airplane, having to ask for water in English.
So we were immigrants, and she was one of the first single moms who raised my brother and me alone, except she had, single moms, it's never easy for any single mom, but she had this big trauma. She lost her whole family, except she had a daughter that was in New York who left Holland before the war started, or before the occupation started. So she had left Holland and went to work in the family business in New York. So they found an apartment for us right underneath my aunt's apartment, because at the end of the war, there was a severe housing shortage. And so we were lucky to get that apartment where we lived a long time, 20 years. The person that it was hardest for was my grandmother, because we were too young. But I know that there's a story that in a letter that my grandmother wrote to my brother's hiding parents, that he complained that he didn't like it in New York and that he wanted to go home to his mother and father, and that must have upset her a lot, but she guarded us from that.
And the Ulysses, Lotte and Mika Ulis, my hiding parents, they had taken care of me as an infant for those 4 years, so it was difficult for them to lose that love object that they had. It just turned out, as I was being removed from their house, she got pregnant with her first daughter. So that made that transition for them easier.
I also was raised by my foster parents as a Catholic. They were very religious Catholics. They took me to church with them for those 4 years. And when we got to New York, I continued with my Catholic education. My grandmother, again, enabled us to do that. She, again, wanted to protect us from anything bad happening to us because we were Jewish. So she thought being Catholic would do that. And we became friends with a Catholic family who lived on the same floor, more or less, as we did in the apartment building, who took us to church with them. There was no open speaking about it. We were not encouraged to speak about it because we were led to believe that we didn't really suffer because we were not in a concentration camp. We were taken care of very well during the war by our respective hiding parents. And so we didn't suffer. But obviously we did suffer because we lost our parents.
Always sort of undercurrent. She openly told us a lot of times, my sister and me, she said, you didn't suffer, I did. You were well taken care of. And that was true. But that doesn't mean we're not Holocaust survivors. We were fortunate that we were taken care of. I think we always knew that our parents weren't with us and that she was taking care of us. I think we always knew that her husband, my grandfather, my parents, and my aunt were murdered. I'm using the word murder. My grandmother, always said that they were overlaid, which means it was sort of literally passed on. The word murder came into my life only after I really began examining these issues starting in the early 1990s.
My grandmother did sit me down when I was older, maybe 11 or so, and tell me what happened. And it was a very traumatic afternoon, as you can well imagine. My grandmother was an amazing woman. We, my brother and I, saved her because she had a reason to live by raising us. And my grandmother, after all she'd been through, she raised us. You know, there was a generation missing. My foster parents, when I did visit them some years later, and I said, well, why did you do this? And they said that they did it because they couldn't not do it.
We asked the Ulysses at one point, you saved our life, you saved my life, why did you do that? And they answered more or less, we did what everybody should have been doing.
I didn't realize that I was a hidden child. That term wasn't really coined. In fact, the word Holocaust wasn't really coined then in the 1940s and 50s. I think that was a term that was coined in the 1960s historically. But when they had a conference in the 1990s at a big hotel, the Marriott Hotel in New York City, with all the hidden children, and Elie Wiesel was even a speaker there, then I realized finally, oh my God, look how many people that are just like me, who had this experience or a similar experience, because hidden children now, they all have a story. Similar, but different. It took that long for me to realize that I was a hidden child, and there were many of them.
And that's a hidden child, the child within, the hidden child stuff, is something that I was aware of. But using the expression hidden child as being a child that was hidden from the Nazis in the wartime period, that was a new use of the term. And it was not my use of the term until 1991. As I said a moment ago, my grandmother always said, you were well taken care of. And I certainly can only speak for me, never felt that I was a Holocaust survivor while she was alive. She was the Holocaust survivor, not me. But when she died, when my grandmother died in 1988, I began to realize that I too was a Holocaust survivor, and the intellectual grasp of the meaning of that started really to come on me in 1991 at the conference of Hidden Children here in New York City. It was an amazing collection of 1,600 white-haired people who had all been hidden in one way or another from the Germans, many and all Jewish, and many of them with stories much more horrific than anything I can tell. In that regard, I'm very fortunate.
I'm a child of Holocaust survivors. My late father was a survivor of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, and my mother was a survivor of 14 months living in the sewers beneath the city of Lvov in what was Nazi-occupied Poland. My mother was born in a little town in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains called Turka, Turka, in March of 1922. She was daughter of a poor Hasidic Jewish watchmaker in that little town. She had two brothers, one of whom became a rabbi. He was able to leave Poland in 1938 with a student visa to come to study at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and he thereby survived the coming Nazi onslaught. My mother had another brother who, along with her parents, was murdered by the Nazis after they occupied that part of Poland. I would say that her upbringing, even though we describe it as really a dirt poor upbringing, was spiritually rich. She had a lot to look forward to in her life. And then and not only that, but she had applied to the Jewish Theological Seminary, to the Teachers Institute, and they had all of her papers, and she was going to be admitted, and then war broke out, and it became impossible for her to join her brother Leon in the United States. And then, of course, when the Nazis came into the city, to the town of Turku, they had periodic actions in which they rounded up the Jews of the town. These are all pretty well documented because they themselves kept meticulous records on the destruction of the Jews. So I've had the opportunity to see the specific documents of how many people were murdered. My mother's family was among the last three families remaining in that town by the end of 1942 because the Germans needed a watchmaker. In November of 1942, when it became clear that the end was near for them too, her parents decided to send her off to a bigger city. My mother told me that the three families remaining in the town decided that she was the one who had the best chance to survive, mainly because she spoke excellent Polish. She knew the Polish liturgy and the Polish Catholic prayers from having been with friends of hers in church, and she also was able to take the identity of a girl she knew from school who was Polish, and whom she knew so well that she would be able to essentially adopt another person's identity. And at the end of November of 1942, she left Turku and never saw her family again. My mother was born with the name of Fija Wind, W-I-N-D, and she the moment she left her hometown, she became Halina Nashkevich. And she retained that first name, Halina, throughout her adult life in the United States as well. It was the name that had enabled her to survive. And headed north to the city of Lvov, which is an 800-year-old city, big city, sort of the capital of Western Ukraine, with a large Jewish, Ukrainian, and Polish population. That's where she ended up. She looked through the papers for rooms that were available. She found a room in the home of a Polish woman named Mrs. Szczepaniak, and she took a room in that woman's home. The woman had two daughters, and my mother was able to stay there for a period of time until the woman held a mass in her home during Christmas time. As my mother told it, she mistakenly reached for the communion wafer with her hand when she didn't realize that she was supposed to just accept it in her mouth. To them, this was an indication that she was not who she said she was. And the woman told her she was going to have to leave. And she gave her an address in the city where she should go. And my mother naively went there, and it was a place where where the Germans were rounding up Jews. and that was how my mother came into the hands of the Nazis. In this place, my mother was obviously with a group of Jews who were destined to be killed. At one point, she actually was handed a form and was asked to sign it, and it was essentially a death warrant. One kind Jewish guy there told her when she was asked to carry out a bucket of excrement to just keep walking. So she did. She kept walking, and she was able to walk to the outskirts of that prison and essentially escape. And then she fell in with a group of Jews who were hiding in the ghetto there. And then on July the 1st of 1943, when the Germans decided to clear the city of the last Jews, what they called the final liquidation, my mother was able to, she essentially found herself being pulled down into the sewer through this tunnel that was created by the people she was with. And she found herself on that day in the sewers of the city of Lvov, along with hundreds of other Jews who had tried to escape into the sewers on that day through other means. And many people drowned because the Peltov River was flowing through the sewer system. Really, the raging current of the river just swallowed people up. She was brought along the side path in the sewer to a hiding place that had been set aside, and she was there. She was told that 3 sewer workers had agreed to save 20 people. And she looked around and she counted how many people were there, and she was the 21st. But they agreed to save her as well. Naturally, nobody knew how long this was going to take. Nobody knew how long the Germans were going to be there in that city, and nobody knew how long the war was going to last. But as it happened, the hours turned into days and turned into weeks and months, and my mother ended up living in those conditions for 14 months. I would say that their worst fear was that they would be found out. Fortunately, the sewer workers had ways of keeping everybody from noticing them, and they also, of course, knew that they had to not make a lot of noise. But that certainly was the biggest fear. Second to that, I guess, would be the fear that they might drown in a storm. They knew, because the sewer workers told them by, I would say, the summer of 1944, that things were not going well for the Germans, and that the Russians were close to retaking the city. And then by the end of July of 1944, the sewer workers came in and told them that it was okay to come out, that the city had been liberated by the Russians. They emerged from a sewer manhole in the courtyard of a monastery on July 27th, 1944. My mother was among the 10 Jews who survived that ordeal. All the others who didn't make it through this whole period were people who decided to leave the sewer because they just couldn't take it anymore, and in every instance they were killed up above. My mother always said that the rats in the sewer were kinder and gentler than the people outside. And one day, soon after surviving the sewer experience, she went back to her town, and townspeople were kind of shocked to see her, and they asked her, how come you're still alive? And she went to her father's watchmaker shop where she grew up, and she found everything in disarray. Not much was there. She scooped up a few documents from the floor, and she took the mezuzah from the doorpost, and she left, never to return. In time, her urgent desire to reunite with her brother in the United States ultimately came to pass. It took a lot of telegramming and letter writing, and ultimately she made contact with her brother in New York, and he was able to help her make arrangements to come to the United States. But that process still took many months. With the assistance of her brother, she was able to get the documentation to finally regain her admission to the Jewish Theological Seminary, where she ended up studying in the city of New York, and she ended up getting a teaching degree from the seminary. The seminary also sent her all over the country to speak about her experiences. For me, it's not at all hard to understand why survivors didn't speak. My own father didn't speak publicly about his experiences until after my mother passed away in 1982, and he sort of took the obligation upon himself to talk to people, because as much as the Germans themselves fully chronicled everything that they did, there are still people today who want to suggest that it never happened. And so my father recognized the importance of talking about it, as painful as it was. So my mother was one of the very first survivors to speak publicly about her experiences. I attribute this to the fact that even though she was surviving under extremely difficult conditions, she still was saved by Polish Catholic sewer workers and their wives, who risked their lives to save Jews. And she still was not exposed to the horrors that so many survivors live through on a daily basis. One of whom was my father, who every day was exposed to the most inhumane brutality in two of the infamous death camps, Auschwitz and Buchenwald. He remembered seeing children thrown live, babies thrown live against brick walls, and of course he saw and smelled the Jews being killed in the gas chambers every day. My mother emerged with a very optimistic attitude about people, and so her story was both a story of brutality and murder of her family, but also an uplifting story about the best in humanity. So the question is whether Hitler succeeded. I feel strongly that Hitler did succeed in eradicating a great deal of Jewish culture, not just the murder of 6 million innocent people, but the culture that existed with them and the promise that existed in the lives of the 2 million children who were Jewish who were murdered.
Did he succeed in suppressing? Did the whole German destruction manage to suppress a whole generation of Jewish culture? It certainly did. Destroyed it.
I think in a way he did. Yeah, he was successful because he killed 6 million Jews who, that was one way of getting rid of the culture, plus people like me who are, because of the war, no longer Jewish.
I think there will always be problems in the world because people dislike other people for whatever their reasons are. I think a lot of the prejudice comes because not just mostly skin color, but I think it's if you are economically successful, people can be prejudiced, or professionally successful. They resent your abilities. And I think that it's what happened to a lot of, in Germany and in Europe. A lot of Jews had abilities that other people did not. They pursued their dreams, and they were, disliked because they were successful. So that basically is what any prejudice is, in my opinion. It's not just, your skin color. So it's what you are able to do and do well. And there were other incidences of genocide, which didn't even become a word until the year I was born, 1948. Rwanda, Darfur. People are dying because of who they are every day. And unfortunately, it's, I don't think, going to change. I don't think there will be anything like the Holocaust again because information is shared so globally now. It was not then. And that people you can't forget. No matter what, you just can't forget.
It's a nice phrase, and there are a lot of good people working towards that end, and not only against anti-Semitism, but against all other forms of prejudice, sexual prejudice. But unfortunately, I think it will continue.
Do we know that mass murders go on? Do we know that there are deranged people who shoot in nightclubs? That's happening all over the world. Do we know that there's bad stuff going on in various countries now where populations are being decimated? We know that to be true.
War and prejudice has existed since time immemorial. And I don't know, unfortunately, I think it's part of the human nature. There are wars, there's Bosnia, there's Rwanda. There's a list so long of there's the Inquisition, religious wars going, way back to the times of the Inquisition in the 1400s and well before. So, unfortunately, it exists and it will exist.
Human beings are very complicated, and those people who argue for a better society, there are some people who argue for a better society naively thinking that a better society is a society that's not going to have conflict in it. I don't believe society is not going to have conflict in it. Out of conflict comes, out of opposition, out of opposite ideas comes often something good, something different, something that you didn't expect, something constructive, innovative, artistic, creative, new. But, God, are people still doing nasty things to each other? Hell yeah. Hitler wasn't the last one, unfortunately.
I think that luck has a lot to do with it, personally, because we were in the we had our traumatic experiences, but the survival factor is luck. And when you interview or talk to any Holocaust survivors, that word luck will enter into it very often. Luckily, my hiding parents took us in. Luckily, I was, other people, there were all sorts of forms of hiding, but they weren't discovered, luckily, and for this reason or that. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And I was lucky.